Pat, do you have a question? Pat Burke from PSU.
Just to add something.
Yep.
But there's also a question of relative size of money that's available, right? As the K-12 system in the world spends about $1.7 trillion, and higher ed spends about $300 billion. So $2 trillion spent worldwide on education. There's no easy way for corporations to even come close to a tenth of that. So it is, at the end of the day, a policy issue, not a corporate issue. Corporations can help in all sorts of ways, you know, participation in all sorts of ways, but they cannot supplant the sort of funding that governments can do, unless, of course, you issue CDSs or interesting financial instruments to get everyone in debt.
Okay, Pat, good.
First of all, I want to thank both of you for being here and for your contributions to Oregon. Oregon has been dealing with some of these issues for a long time, and your work has been a part of that work. So, for example, recently redesigned mathematics standards concentrate on 4 general areas. Statistics and probability is one of those 4 areas, along with math problem solving. The other issue for all of us right now, and sort of the basis of my question, is you raised just now the issue, the balance between policy and implementation. So the Oregon Board of Education in 2007 established as graduation requirements 9 essential skills that are in many ways based upon your work. So global understanding, problem solving, being able to use technology, and so on. These are now part of the high school graduation requirements in the state. Okay? Now, the problem becomes operational. It is relatively easy to measure reading and mathematics. It is much harder to measure global awareness in some way that is fair, reasonably predictable, valid, and reliable. If you can't reach that level of standard, then holding somebody accountable for it, i.e. denying a high school diploma, is going to be challenged, and correctly so. So my question is, how do we take your concepts and operationalize them into measurable outcomes?
Great question. So I'll give you an example. In one of the networks of schools that I've worked with, they have a graduation portfolio. They collect examples of evidence of all those skills being learned in their learning adventures during school. And they have to present with rubrics that a panel of judges, includes teachers and principal and others, community members, set rubrics. They have to present their work. They're judged by it. If they don't pass, they have to make up some work. They have to do something that shows that they can actually have that skill in place by performance, by examples of student work by performance. Is that reliable, valid, and all the rest? Maybe not as much as a bubble test, but certainly when you see, you know, the butterfly example, when you see the progression across, you can see the skills being developed. You can use rubrics. Some of those rubrics are cross-validated across different teachers in the school and the rest. And I think it's reliable enough and valid enough, in addition to some other measures that maybe, you know, bubble test and the rest of it that are added to that. Those are also done. And the combination of those is a better, fuller picture of the whole child. And I think that's where we have to head. And what's interesting is that the entire world at this point is in the same place. They're all stuck right at this moment. I was in Singapore before I came here, 22 hours of flying. I was awake for some reason, I'm not sure why. But they're right at that moment. They're right at that edge. They've been training in professional development, all their teachers to do projects, to do inquiry, to do design, but yet they still have one test. And once the test is coming, everything else drops off the plate, and they have to study for the test. So what I was encouraging them to do, a lot of other people are encouraging them to do, is have a set of master projects. A student picks one of those, builds a portfolio, sends the evidence, all the evidence, to a team that reviews it, scores it, and gives it a number just like their other tests. They add those 2 numbers together, and that's their score. That's the next step. And the first country to do that is going to take a very big leap forward. Singapore may be it.
There are There are actually a couple of projects currently underway. Oregon is in one of them that is moving in that direction. Oregon's assessment system, for example, is an online assessment system, and that system is now being adapted to allow for things like manipulation of objects on the screen, conducting experiments on the computer with the results being looked at. The issue for me partially becomes equity from district to district, especially in a state that has a large urban-rural divide. 56% of the districts in the state of Oregon have fewer than 1,000 students in them. We're relatively a small rural state with pockets of urban sophistication, if you will. Not that rural districts are not sophisticated, but we simply have more resources in the Portland metro area to do the kinds of things you're talking about than you would in Malheur County. So finding that balance and a sense of fairness and equity in policy across the entire state is a challenge that we're facing.
I've got one more question. Trip, you want to take one more?
Yeah, just in your travels, I mean, the last decade, actually less than the last decade, there's been just so much talk about emphasis on math and science. And it's just been a focus for nationally. And I think sometimes it's at the expense of the arts. And so when I saw your presentation today, you're advocating for a more balanced approach. And I'm just curious if you could sort of maybe speak to what you're seeing around the country. Are we seeing more of a balanced approach, or are people recognizing that maybe that emphasis on math and science is not necessarily misguided, but that the balanced approach is more appropriate?
I think what we're seeing first is that people are realizing that getting rid of humanities and arts was a mistake, and people are starting to throttle back from that. So the efforts of all of you for the past decade or so are starting to bear fruit. But we're also seeing really the understanding that, again, it's an and proposition. It's not one or the other. I don't know if you'll be able to stay with us this afternoon, but the whole presentation will be geared on that, and I'll give you a preview, even if I spoil the surprise for the others. But it's really a question of STEM for employability, humanities for excellence. And I use the iPod as an example. As we go through what it takes to make a device this successful, you will see that the genius that Steve Jobs and people underappreciate is actually the fact that he brought the humanities into technology, and he humanized it because he had anthropologists, because he has designers and artists participate with the design teams. And in an environment which I grew up in engineering, semiconductor, hardcore, let me tell you that mindset in the 80s and 90s was completely foreign. And now, by hook or by crook, it's forced all the other mega corporations to understand that it was not just a nice thing, it was a necessity. So now you have the Googles and Microsoft of the world that are trying to do the same. There's still an issue of personality of companies that comes into play. If there's too much, let's call it simplistically left brain dominance, then you see that some habits are hard to break. That's why I compare the iPhone user interface and the Android user interface. No matter how good Android is, there's still something odd about how you have to manipulate things. Too many steps, sometimes too logical for its own sake. So you'll see that becoming more and more part. So again, rebalancing humanities and STEM, not one or the other. And by the way, it's part of the slide where you'll see this afternoon. If you're going to pay $125,000 for a PhD in engineering employed here in the US versus $30K, $40K in India, there's a 3x differential. You better get something more than just the engineering. And I don't mean to demean engineering, but it has to be engineering plus creativity, so all sorts of ROI.
I will tell you a story that captures this. Ministries from China, education ministry from China, came to visit a new tech school, and their eyes were getting wider and wider as they see these kids kind of collaborating and building models and doing environmental studies and how to make the school more efficient than the rest, and doing videos and all this. And they're just going, "This is amazing!" So they can't wait to get together afterwards. And just grab your book there. One of the persons just grabs the curriculum guide and says, where in here do you teach creativity and innovation? We need to do this in China. Show us where it is in the curriculum. And we've said, well, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is not in the curriculum. It's in our culture. It's in Edison and Ford and Steve Jobs and the rest. And we do have that edge here in the United States that China really doesn't have and may not have it for a long time, although it is learnable. And that's the good news, is that it is learnable. And they're dead set on learning it any way they can. They think they can learn it by studying a curriculum. You know, not true. So it's about the culture. And so what I think is so amazing at this point in time is that we have such a demand for creativity and innovation coming from everywhere. In fact, that's the future of work. We have a culture that is totally ready to deliver on that, but we have an education system that has kicked it out. That's the challenge now in our education system, is to put that back into the learning process.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Pat and Tripp for their contributions today, and let's thank Bernie and Charles for this morning's session.